All right, Jessica, if you're ready, I think we can go ahead and get started.
Sounds good.
Okay, cool. All right, well, welcome to our first session of the school year for our parent education series. We created this parent education series a few years ago, just to kind of talk about different topics that are really common in the learning difference world and kind of give our parents some tools to work with and a little bit more understanding of what their kids are going through. Today, we're super excited to have our new partner psychologist, Dr. Jessica Anderson, with us to talk about the psychoeducational assessment process. She'll go over everything as to why your kid needs one, and what that report looks like and what to look for on the report once you get it back. So if you have any questions, we're going to wait until the very end. We'll take all the questions that we have. She has a lot of information to go through, so we want to make sure we hear everything. And yes, and I'll be checking in the chat too. So if you have any questions in the middle that you think you're going to forget, you can send them in the chat and we'll go over them. All right, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Anderson, to get started.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining today. I'm really excited to be here and hopefully shed some light on this topic and make it a little bit less confusing for everyone. I know throughout my career, besides the fact that I've been doing this for 20 years and it's been a big part of my life, so many friends and family have reached out after their student either was referred for an evaluation or they received it back and just were at a loss of what to do with the information and kind of what it all meant. So I really am hopeful that I can bring some clarity to this topic. Just really quick background, I have been a school and clinical psychologist for about 20 years. I've worked in public schools, independent schools, private practice. I've supervised students who were going through graduate school to learn how to administer these assessments and evaluate them. And I've taught classes at the graduate level on this topic. So it's definitely near and dear to my heart and a big part of what I've been doing for the past 20 years. I'm also really excited to be partnering with Trident because they are already providing such an incredible support to your students. And this is just another way to continue to do that. So let's kind of dive in and talk a little bit about what we'll cover today. Hopefully give you a good explanation of what a psychoeducational evaluation is, what the value is, why this is so important, the information that it provides to clinicians, to educators, and hopefully to you and your students, what these different tests are actually assessing, and a little bit about the numbers. They can be very confusing, so giving you kind of a general overview of what to look for there. And then, as Hallie said, please drop your questions in the chat. At the end, I'm happy to try to answer as many of those as we can, or if there's questions at the end, I'm happy to go through those. All right. So just starting with what is a psychoeducational assessment? There's a practical definition here on this slide, but really this is the assessment tools that help us understand a student's ability level as well as academic skills. And they're based on developmental expectations. They're not based on a specific school's standards. And while it's really important to note how a student is performing compared to their classmates, that's not the criteria for determining if a student has a learning difference or a diagnosis. So we are administering a series of subtests that give us information about how a student processes information and then how it relates to their academic success. These tests are normed across the continent on students of the same age and developmental level. So it gives us a much larger pool of data than just something that's coming from the specific school standard. Of course, we're going to go back at the end and look at the student's environment to determine recommendations, best practices, accommodations, modifications, all of those things. But a school's expectations are not always in line with research-based developmental norms. This is the information that gives clinicians a much clearer picture of how a student is processing information, where their strengths are, and what might be challenging. Just kind of an example of this is if a student is struggling with reading and they're not performing well in the classroom, maybe they're not performing well on assessments or they're reluctant to read in class, these assessments really help us understand why. We could certainly throw out a bunch of hypotheses, but until we really get a sense of what's going on, our interventions will not be tailored to that student's needs. It could be their ability to decode, being, that phonemic awareness, or it could be working memory and how that impacts their comprehension or their fluency. These are different areas and we would support them differently. So just kind of giving hopefully a little bit clearer picture of why these tests are different than the tests a student might experience in their school setting. So the question always comes up if you're doing a private evaluation, why is it so expensive? I am aware that throughout the country, the cost actually doesn't vary that much, whether you're in New York City or you're in, rural Oklahoma, that it kind of a private evaluation is expensive. And the reason has to do with the level of training of the clinician, as well as the test materials. So in order to be able to administer these tests, you need to have gone through an advanced graduate degree, either at the master's plus level or the doctorate level. From state to state, it varies a bit about who is allowed to administer private evaluations. In some states, you have to be a doctoral level clinician with postdoc experience and licensure. In other states, you need to at least have the school psych certification or master's of clinical psych and have done some extra training in this specific area. So just the cost of what it took to go to school to be able to administer these tests is part of it. Then there is the time, the actual time we spend one-on-one with the student assessing them isn't enormous. Usually it's 8 to 10 hours at the most. Where the time really comes in is in analyzing all the data, putting the puzzle pieces together, and really being able to make those strong recommendations and potentially diagnoses for your child. The cost of the materials is also a factor. As I mentioned, these tests are normed across the country and continent, so an enormous amount of research goes into collecting the data to make sure the tests are of great value and that we are comparing to a normative sample. They are updated about every 10 years, and some of the bigger tests, that means they cost upwards of $1,000 because of everything that went into making them. So there is just the cost of having these tests. So just a little bit of background about where that expense comes from. But what are you getting out of this? In addition to kind of what I shared on that last slide of why it's so important for clinicians, is that you are getting this really individualized, comprehensive report with very detailed information about your student, their strengths, and then what they find challenging. The recommendations should be utilized in the school or academic setting to really help tailor their instruction. And the diagnosis part is what you need in order to get reimbursement from insurance companies or to receive those modifications in places outside of the school setting. So, for example, if your student is going to sit for an SAT or an ACT, you need this information. If your student would like to receive accommodations for an exam to enter the military or a trade school, they would need this information. It's the documentation that says, yes, this is actually a thing, and it is important for my student to have these accommodations in order to really understand their knowledge. So this is kind of their ticket to all of the services that they deserve. Then if we kind of move on to what these tools are, you will see the cognitive, the achievement, behavioral, and social. These are the 4 domains that really go into a comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation. The acronyms that you see in the blue part of the screen, that's kind of our psych language rather than every time we're talking about an assessment saying the very long Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, 5th edition. We just say WISC. And the Roman numeral or the number that you see after those acronyms are just the version of the test. And you have to stay updated and you cannot use outdated testing. So it's important just to, indicate which tests that you are using to stay in ethical compliance. So what are these? All right, so the cognitive, if we look at the Psychological Association's definition, is an individually administered test used to determine a person's level of intelligence by measuring their ability to solve problems, form concepts, reason, acquire detail, and perform other intellectual tasks. It comprises mental, verbal, and performance tasks of graded difficulty that have been standardized by use on a representative sample of the population. So what does that all mean? It's the way your brain processes information. It should stay pretty steady over time without much change. The only time that we would predict to see a change is if someone experiences a traumatic brain injury or a very significant medical issue. But otherwise, this is what typically is referred to as IQ, and it should stay the same over time. The achievement is the academic tests. These are those tests that measure the academic skills that you typically see in an educational setting: reading, writing, math, and some of the oral language, auditory processing type things. Behavioral is what else might be impacting your students' ability to be successful. Could it be something to do with their greater executive functioning skills? Could it be a level of anxiety or ADHD? Maybe there's some other mood factors. We certainly want to take that into consideration because it can be a very big factor in terms of why they are having difficulty and, of course, then how we would intervene. And then the last part is social. So again, these aren't just numbers. This is a student. We want to know all about them so that we can really tailor the interventions to fit their needs. So if there are things that came up in their medical history, maybe they had a significant life change, maybe they needed to change schools several times. Those are things that are important as we understand who they are as a learner, and we help support them. One of the things that you'll hear as we talk about the cognitive assessment, which is typically the one that's most confusing to folks, is this idea of quantitative reasoning. You'll see this come up as a measure. And so I highlight that one just to really kind of go over that. What that means is the ability to understand, analyze, and apply concepts and data to solve real-world problems and make informed decisions. It comes up a lot because as you get older and you're going through school, you are typically required to make more of these decisions without the information just being given to you. So it's less about knowing your number facts and more about being able to analyze a word problem or a higher level math concept. Same idea with writing. It's not about just writing a complete sentence. It's being able to express your ideas fluently and coherently. For reading comprehension, it's really the ability to read something and not just be able to give back the factual information, names, dates, places, but make inferences and predictions, kind of talk about how you think the character might have felt. So that's a big part of what we're analyzing in the cognitive domains, because we want to see how well a student can do this, because that could be impacting their success, especially as they get to those middle and high school levels. You will hear about 4 areas in the cognitive assessments. So there is the verbal comprehension and perceptual reasoning, which you see on this slide. On the next slide, we'll look a little bit more closely at working memory and processing speed. What's important to understand is that we're assessing these domains in terms of what a student's natural abilities are And then we're comparing that to how they're doing on the achievement side. So, for example, if we look at that verbal comprehension piece, and a student seems to have pretty average or high average ability to answer acquired knowledge questions, to reason with verbal information, just kind of knowledge of their culture and language, then we would expect them to do well on subtests on the achievement side that have to do with vocabulary and word knowledge. If they're not doing well on the achievement side, then that tells us there's something getting in the way. There's something interfering because they have the ability. They showed us that on the cognitive tests, but they're not able to demonstrate that on the achievement tests. And that's where we start digging and putting the pieces together to figure out, well, what is getting in the way and how can we help that student be more successful? Perceptual reasoning is one that most students actually really enjoy these tests because they're very novel and different, sometimes kind of very interesting. This is where you'll hear them looking at blocks and having to put together patterns. They tend to like them, which is always nice. But how does that relate to what they're doing in school? Well, that gives us a lot of information about how they're able to analyze the different things that they're seeing. It also helps us understand how they do with visual information, which certainly becomes important when we're talking about interventions as well as academic classes like geometry. So sometimes that can be a little bit hard to relate to when we talk about a subtest and we're saying that they put block design pictures together. And parents are like, well, what does that have to do with school? It's really kind of goes back to that quantitative reasoning. How well do you do with information and how can you analyze and then apply it to something else? So working memory and processing speed are the other two important cognitive domains that we really look into. The working memory is a student's ability to hold information in awareness and then use it. This is the idea of mental math. So it's not short-term memory, it's not long-term memory. Working memory is having information, holding it in awareness, and then doing something with it. It's very important when it comes to some, like I mentioned, mental math. It also is important when it comes to reading comprehension because you need to understand and be aware of what you've read and then be able to do something like make a prediction after you've received that information. Processing speed is a big one that comes up. That's where often that accommodation of extended time plays in. Processing speed is really just the ability to process simple visual information. Simple is highlighted here because the tests really are simple. It's just, do you have the skill? And if you have the skill and you're not able to really show that in an academic setting, then again, we're looking at what's getting in the way. Is it just the amount of material on the page that's overwhelming? Or is it the content area? Is it something else? Because you're showing in the cognitive domain that you are able to process information in a timely manner. Something else is tricking you up if you're not able to finish tasks in the amount of time that is expected. All right, so taking a look at the numbers, this can get very, very confusing. The numbers are statistical analysis that if you're a math person, you can really dig into and geek out on all the numbers and how these numbers are created. When you go through the training, you actually learn the exact statistical analysis and you can score everything and do all of the statistics by hand. Thankfully, we do not have to do that on a regular basis, and we have scoring programs that help us, which makes it much more efficient, but you absolutely can. The important thing to kind of take from this is that for most of the tests you will see, and most of the numbers that will appear in the report, you're dealing with the kind of bell curve, the average distribution in the population. 100 is the number that is right in the middle. So that gray, black line that kind of intersects the top of that hump and goes right down to the bottom with 34% on either side. That is dead average. And the number that corresponds with that is 100. Most of the population falls in that 68%, the standard deviation to the left and the standard deviation to the right. So those correlate to scores between 85 and 115. So if you have a score between those two numbers, it is considered average. There are certainly some benefits to being on the higher end of the average range and some challenges on the lower end of the average range, but that's typically where most of the population lives. If you fall below in that next 13.5%, then that certainly can make life more challenging. The way your brain processes information is just a bit different, and it can make learning new information more difficult. If you're in that other side, the 13.5% or above that fall above a 115, life can be easier. There are certainly academic classes and information that you're just able to process, retain information, complete more quickly, but it's not everything. So it can be a benefit, but there are certainly other factors. So again, this kind of just gives us the baseline of where a student is functioning, so then we can compare it to those achievement tests. Again, kind of going back to how this relates is that if a student receives a score of 100 on that verbal comprehension index, all of their subtests add up in that area, that average ability, then we're going to assume that they should be performing average, compared to their peers academically. If they're not, again, that's where we're digging in and figuring out what's getting in the way. Because they have average ability, why aren't they able to show us that in the classroom? All right, so what to look for. So you get this huge report, and it is very wordy. There is a lot of psychological jargon in most of these reports, and they can be very hard to understand and incredibly overwhelming. So typically, and even clinicians do this if we're reading someone else's report, we flip to the summary. And it's actually why in my graduate program, we were trained to put the summary on the first page of the report, because that's where everybody goes first. When we flip to that summary, or it's right on the first page, we're looking for some specific things. We really want to see if there's any terms that give us an indication of a diagnosis that is relative to school, and then also if they list a diagnosis in more of a clinical way. So breaking that down. In this example of a summary, I would be scanning this and I would immediately see the term specific learning disability. Okay, this student has qualified based on the testing to it was determined that they have a specific learning disability. That's helpful, but I need to know in what, because there are lots of different areas. So I keep reading and I see that their specific learning disability would be in the area of reading decoding, reading fluency, spelling, and written expression. So by default, it looks like they're actually pretty solid in math. I probably don't need to go deep into recommendations for math. But when it comes to the decoding and fluency, that's an area we're going to need to help support, as well as spelling and written expression. Additional information, though, is really helpful here because that might not be the whole picture. So I keep scanning, I keep reading, and I see the term executive functioning. Again, great. That helps me understand that there are some areas that this student could use support in. Executive functioning is another large umbrella term. There are several subfactors that go underneath that term. Typically, we're not bad at all of our executive functioning skills. There are usually 3 to 4 that might give us trouble. So this student has difficulty with time management, organization, and working memory. So this all goes into the creation of how we're going to support the student in school. We now know that we need to provide intervention for reading decoding, reading fluency, spelling, and written expression. And we certainly want to take into account their difficulty with time management, organization, and working memory as we're creating a plan to support the student. This is that diagnosis page that I was referring to. These are clinical terms, and this is, again, what gives you that ticket for funding, whether it's reimbursement for insurance, whether it's scholarship or support at the state or federal level, whether it's getting access to services at a agency, organization, sometimes at the college level, depending on the criteria of documentation. The letter and number are called the International Classification of Diseases. You would see this in the medical world as well. It really is used specifically for insurance, but again, it can also be used for these other agencies. The F is the indicator for mental, behavioral, and neurodevelopmental disorders. And the number refers to the specific diagnosis. So in public school, this doesn't really come up. They use kind of their own criteria for how to support students. But again, going back to insurance, organizations, agencies, they will require this type of coding. And that comes from this really comprehensive evaluation where we can look at all the factors and be able to provide a diagnosis. This is another example of how you can look at the report. So we looked at the summary and the diagnosis that usually comes at the end of a report. But then in the middle, you have all of these paragraphs about all of the tests that your student went through. Again, tend to be very wordy. I will admit, quite boring to read, even as someone who writes them. So things, if you would like to go through it, and dig in and try to understand it, these are some of the things that you want to look for. So the narrative is important to us as clinicians because it provides the story. If we just look at the numbers, that gives us information about strengths and weaknesses, but it doesn't give us the why, and the why is very important. So if we look at this example of a paragraph about how this student performed on the perceptual reasoning index on the cognitive assessment, there are several subtests that fall under this index, and that gives you the overall score. So this student earned a standard score of 98. If we remember back, 100 is average, so 98 is right there, again, in the average range. 45th percentile means they performed as well or better than 45% of the population. Again, 50 is average, so they're right there. So right away, I'm like, okay, this student seems to be doing pretty well in this area. But I'm wondering why. What were there any strengths and weaknesses within this domain, or was everything average? And I keep reading, and everything was average. They were just solidly average throughout all the subtests on this domain, which is great to see. There's no areas of weakness within it. This should be an area that they perform well. If we refer back to that summary where they were diagnosed with a specific learning disability in reading and writing and spelling, I now know that there was a difficulty with them showing this amount of information on the achievement tests. So that would be, again, part of what we're doing to figure out how to support them. But in terms of their cognitive ability, everything looks really solid here. But in addition, if I want to know why this is a solid area, maybe what about these tests was really helpful for the student, I can see that they were engaged. They were especially interested in visual tasks. The novel tasks seemed really interesting, and they showed a lot of perseverance. So that's really helpful to know when, again, thinking about what supports would be beneficial. It sounds like they would benefit from having a lot of visual reminders or visual cues to help them along the way. This is just one more example of the Verbal Comprehension Index. Here we see that the student was in the low average range. So this is an area that's already a bit challenging for them. But again, is it across the board or were there strengths and weaknesses within this domain? So if I scan through, I can see that by looking at the average versus low average range indicators, that vocabulary was okay. There might be some challenging words along the way if they're doing some higher level reading, but your basic everyday reading level vocabulary wasn't a problem. Also, their general knowledge was age appropriate. So just being able to navigate the world around them and pick up information, not a problem. Really, it was more about expanding those verbal answers and comparing words and drawing similarities. So that's an area that I would want to take a closer look at as I'm supporting the student in school. So these are just two examples of the content that you will find in the report. It can be, again, very wordy, lots of vocabulary and language that isn't typically found in normal conversation, some psychobabble, which is not helpful. Look at those descriptors, those indicators of average, low average, high average. They will help you give context to where your student was performing. The person who performs the evaluation should absolutely be sitting down and going over all of this with you. It is part of the process to help you digest the information, understand the information, and really understand your student in another way. And to really focus on the recommendations, because that's what, as a parent, you will be advocating for when you are helping your student get what they need. So, looking at what the recommendations are at the end of the report from the clinician who's taken the time to analyze all this data and put this together, being able to understand those and why they're important is really your best tool. I also advocate that as a student gets to middle school, definitely high school, that they start to learn why their recommendations are important as well. And they're able to start speaking to that. So when they're sitting in front of a admissions officer for college or a recruiter, sitting in an interview, they can really advocate for themselves and be able to say, if I can have extended time on this assessment, I will be able to show you my wealth of knowledge because it takes me a bit longer to process verbal information, or because my reading fluency is just a little bit slower, but I can understand everything and I want to show you everything that I was able to take from that document. Whatever it might be, they're able to really speak to it and explain why it's important for them. And I think that gives them a lot of power and really shows how dedicated and committed they are to their success. All right, so this was an enormous amount of information in a very short time. Please keep in mind that we go to school for anywhere from 3 to 5 years to learn how to analyze these tests, how to give them, how to break all the pieces down, look at the different components, and understand a student's learning profile. So this was just kind of a general overview to try to help make more sense of it. But I think I would hope some of the takeaways are that this information is really important to understand your students' strengths and challenges. It's the best way to figure that out. They then take that information to provide those really personalized recommendations that will get your student the services that they deserve. And then it's the documentation that's required for educational institutions, state, national agencies, insurance. It's your ticket to get those services. So I'm going to pause here since I know I've been talking a lot at you and see if there are some questions or areas that would be great to go back to shed more light on. I don't know if Hallie, if there's anything in the chat there or anything else that came up.
No, nothing in the chat, nothing that I have.
One thing, just to add about Trident specifically, is one of the reasons, I would hope that this is known as being at the school, is Orton Gillingham is that multisensory approach that really helps with the intervention in these areas. So typically, when we are diagnosing and assessing a student and a reading or language issue comes up, that is our best recommendation. So it's amazing to be in a place like this where the kind of gold standard of what will help a student succeed is just part of the program. It's at the heart of the program. So just one of the reasons why it's so important to have that intervention.
Okay, I do have some questions coming in.
Sure.
What is the best way to go about getting a referral for a psychoeducational eval? My son had one 5 years ago, and he is in his senior year. This information would be helpful for moving on to college.
Absolutely. So, couple things. Typically, we wind up for college students entering college. Yes, you would definitely want to redo their evaluation. One, because colleges or any agency outside of high school require the evaluation to be within the past 3 years. So if they haven't had one in that time frame, they will require it to be done again. Also, you need the adult version of that cognitive test. It is one of the times that we redo the cognitive test. Even though your cognition should stay the same over time, you need that adult version. So when I was working in public schools or when I was in private practice, we would make a point to reevaluate all of our students. We tried to get to them all junior year so that they had that information for accommodations on SATs, ACTs, any sort of testing, and they had it ready to go to submit to the services at the college level, which is a separate entity. They review the report and then they determine what they're able to provide. So it's really important to get that information and meet with those counselors so you understand the services that the individual institutions can offer. Some of those services are free or with tuition, I should say, and some are an additional cost. So I always think it's great to really research that because it may really impact where you want to spend the next 4 years of your life. And then in terms of referral, anyone can request from a private evaluator to have their student assessed. You can reach out to, any of the private evaluators in the area and ask for that. If you are in public school, then you can request that within the school, and they should be able to redo the evaluation as part of transition planning, which is a kind of federal part of supporting students with special education, especially if they have not had an evaluation done in the past 3 years. Hopefully that answers.
Awesome. I have another question. What is the correct age to have an evaluation? My daughter is 8 and has dyslexia, and her little brother is 6 years old.
Sure. So there's no right or wrong about when you have the first one. It's really when you start to see concerns and interventions that are appropriate for that developmental level don't seem to be helping. So in the public school world or best practices, if we saw a student in kindergarten, first grade, who was kind of struggling to pick up reading at the same pace as their age peers, we would provide some specialized instruction to see if they just need it to be delivered, if they need more repetition or if they need a little bit more one-on-one. And if they're able to then continue to catch up or do well with just kind of that intervention level, then that's great. If that doesn't seem to be helping and the student is still struggling, whether it's reading, math, or any type of written language. Then we would do an assessment to see what else might be going on. So typically, I mean, unless we see something that is, more significant, a student isn't, is really kind of not meeting developmental norms. Usually, it will happen around that first, second grade age. But there's no right or wrong. There are certainly students that we don't assess until later because they're just able to kind of do well, and then something gets tricky when they're in fourth or fifth grade. But usually it's in early elementary school for specific learning disability. That's when it comes up. But if your 6-year-old's doing well, then I wouldn't worry about it, but see how they do. And then, yeah, we go from there.
Awesome. Another question, which of the WISC scores most closely relate to reading fluency/fluency in general?
So for the WISC scores, you'd be looking at the subtests under the Verbal Comprehension Index. But it also has to do with working memory. So fluency has a lot to do with not just your understanding of language, but also if you are able to process information quickly, so that's processing speed and working memory. So there's not one score, we're looking at several when it comes to fluency and comprehension.
Awesome. I think our last question, what age are you switched to an adult evaluation? Is it when you're done with college? Oh, 17. Okay.
16.
Oh, 16.
Yep. At 16, you are able to take the adult form, which is the, instead of the WISC, it's the WAIS, Wechsler Adult Intelligence. And again, that's why we typically wait until students are in their junior year, because by that point, most of them have turned 16. And we give them the test then. Certainly colleges can offer assessment. It can be a little bit longer waiting list, or depending on what the college offers, whether they have someone on site or not. But if you're already identified as a student with a learning difference, we highly, highly, highly recommend having it done before they get to college. And again, once they have turned 16.
Okay, that's all the questions I have. I have a lot of thank yous for you as well. And yeah, that's all the questions we have. JP, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk real quickly just about the social emotional piece, as somebody that's been through the process of the testing, and my son will probably be going through the testing too eventually. But I think it just needs to be said that as parents, the best thing you could possibly do for your child during these testing dates is just ease the situation, bring a calmness to the situation. It is very, very daunting to walk into a test as a child and to have to sit in front of somebody and feel like you're getting everything wrong, because the instructors are not told to tell you whether you're right or wrong. It's more or less they just continue through the testing process. So I really just, as somebody that's been through it, I know how it feels just to second guess yourself on everything during the process. So I think just talking to your child before and after, and just let them know, hey, just go in there and try your best, right? There's no right or wrong answers. It's just, we just need you just to give it your best shot. And then of course, at the end, I would definitely do something fun. A lot of times kids will hold back from actually expressing their feelings. I know that's shocking to hear for many of us as parents, but just know that took a whole lot out of them. Emotionally, it's draining. And I think just showing them that you are appreciative of them going through this process, because at the end of the day, when you're talking to a child, they don't understand how important this is for their rest of their life, right? Like, understanding how they learn at an early age helps the school, which then helps them in the long run. So just in that social emotional pieces, just really back them up and feed them confidence that, we're just really proud that you went in there and you gave it your best shot. I'm telling you, it may not sound like a lot, but for that child that has just felt like they battled the demon in the dark pits of a cave for hours, it means a lot. It really, really does. So that's really all I can touch on. I think, Dr. Anderson did a really good job really explaining the subtest scores and things like that. This is only the tip of the iceberg. I'm sure Dr. Anderson can explain that. And if you do have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or to Hallie, and then we can get you in contact with Dr. Anderson, because I'm sure as you get your child's evaluation, and you're reading through it, you could be like, hey, what in the world does this actually mean? And we just didn't quite get to it in this session because of time restraints. Just feel free to reach out to Trident Academy as a whole. We're here to help, whether your child comes here or not. We want to make sure that the community knows that, we're not just here to offer help to our kids and our families. We want to make sure that we're helping everybody. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Jessica, I do have one more question. Is there a timeline for testing that we follow from the first test?
Sure, great question. Yes. So from the first test, every 3 years, you need to have an updated evaluation to, again, keep those services in place. Now, that being said, you don't have to do every test every 3 years. So typically, kind of going back to that question about when to test again before college or leaving high school, we will do the cognitive assessment, the full battery for an initial assessment. Again, we need to kind of get the best picture of your student. So we're doing everything in that initial eval. Then let's say that happens when your student is in second grade. Then 3 years later, when they're, fourth, fifth, they need to be reevaluated. And so we don't really need to do the cognitive tests again. Again, that should be the same, but we do want to do achievement again. And we might be looking into some of those other factors, about attention, and, anything else that might be going on that is impacting your student at that time. The achievement test, it really helps us understand the progress they're making and what's working and maybe what isn't working so that we can reevaluate that. And again, it's the ticket you need to continue to get your support, your funding, your IEP, whatever it is in the setting you're in. So every 3 years we're doing that. And then when we get to that high school test, we are doing the cognitive again so that we have that information for them to launch and have everything they need once they leave high school. There are certainly times where we will revisit a cognitive assessment if something has happened. Again, I worked with a student who she fell off an ATV and had a brain injury. We needed to redo her cognitive assessment. We really needed to understand how that impacted her. So there are certainly exceptions to that. Or if you had one at preschool and now you're 12, probably want to look at that again. But otherwise, every 3 years, but it doesn't have to be every test.
Awesome. Well, that is all the questions I have. Dr. Anderson, thank you so much for joining us. I think this was a super helpful session, and I'm excited to share this with the rest of our community that couldn't be here today. And we're excited to have you at Trident and helping our families.
Thank you. I am very excited to be here. This is something I love doing. And to JP's point, we really, or at least me, I try very hard not to make it torture for your student and to let them know that they really are doing an incredible job, and we will get through it with as much fun as possible. So thank you for having me. And I hope this just kind of helped shed some light on this really complex thing.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, everybody, have a great day. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.